Hi everyone, it's Neve here and welcome to the ScrapFX YouTube channel. Today we're going to be doing a 12 by 12 scrapbook page called A Different Perspective. So this is using the new Steampunk range from ScrapFX, and I'm starting off with the intersection stencil, which is kind of more like a mask than a stencil, I suppose. And in my large dilutions journal I'm spritzing on some brown spray from Tattered Angels, sort of squishing it around and basically using the mask or the stencil as a stamp. So I'm using my paper towel just to press it down the background. The paper I'm using is an old paper from Basic Grey. I love the Basic Grey papers because they sort of are already grunged up anyway, and they work really well with this steampunk style. So I'm going in with a stamp from ScrapFX from, I think it's IO Design Stamps, and it's just a random text stamp, lots of blocky letters, just to add some interest down the border. And I'm using Distress Oxide to do that with walnut stain. And then going in with one of the large stamps from ScrapFX, the Calculus one. I think it's called Calculation Stamp, sorry. So I didn't ink it up perfectly because I wanted it to be that really grungy in the background, just a hint of what was happening. So now I'm going in with the box shape stamp, and I've got some vintage paper that I'm using and just stamping it out again in that walnut stain over the top of the text that I've got there. One thing I love about these stamps is they retain so much ink, so you can get multiple stampings. With that one stamp, I actually practiced to see how many images I could get on the page. I was nearly able to fill up a whole A4 page of pattern before the ink ran out. Now obviously it got more faded as it went down the page, but it actually gave a really beautiful ombre effect. So ink up your stamp and have a go, and you'll be really surprised with how many stampings you can get from it. So before I committed to doing anything, I had all the bits and pieces that I wanted to use on my page, and I just wanted to sort of try everything out. So I've got the fractured time element, chipboard elements I was going to put in the two corners on my page. I've got the saying A Different Perspective, and then I've got some of these Project Life cards that were gifted to me, so I'm not 100% sure where they came from. They were just Project Life cards I had in my stash, and I like using them sort of as more ephemera bits in the background rather than for Project Life. I have done one or two Project Life pages, but I tend to end up using them for something other than what they're intended for. They make great card fronts as well, so just if you've got some in your stash, don't just think you need to use them for scrapbooking. You can use them for all sorts of things. I wasn't very clever with the way I glued all this down, so I'm using double-sided tape. It tends to be my go-to when I'm gluing things down, is to use double-sided tape, but I realized as I was doing this that I had to keep turning over to make sure everything was in the right place, and there was probably a better way to do it, really. Perhaps, you know, laying it all down and then sticking my photo over the top would have been the more sensible way to go, but why would you do anything in a sensible way? So once I've got my sort of ephemera cluster, my photo cluster all happening, got it all glued together, ready to stick down on my page. I decided as I was doing it though that I wanted to just make it sort of pop out of the page somewhat, but still blend into the background. So I had some of this shimmery vellum in my stash, and I just glued it down onto this and then tore the edges. Now I'm a real fan of torn edges. I don't particularly like using straight edges or scissors all that much. If I can tear something out, I tend to do that. It's just a personal preference for me. I like that sort of distressed, aged effect in most everything that I do. I also had this graph paper that I thought would work really well, particularly because I had that calculation stamp in the background. I thought I could incorporate that in some way, shape or form, just to add a little bit of difference to the page, and I played around with it and played around with it, and then decided that I didn't actually like it, so it didn't go on the page. It was just a little bit too white, and if I ended up aging it, it wouldn't have really blended, and it was also covering in a lot of the background, which I quite liked, so I didn't want to get rid of that too much. So that's one of the things, and that's the reason why I like sort of auditioning pieces to begin with, just so I know where it's going and what's happening and what I like and what I don't like before I make too big a decision about it. It's one of the reasons why my scrapbooking style is very different from my art journaling style. I don't know why, but I tend to get a little bit more tentative about what I'm doing when I'm scrapbooking. I think it's because it's got pictures on it, and I know it's more likely other people are going to be looking at it, so I tend to get a little bit, not worried about it, but just a little bit more particular about what I'm doing. Whereas a scrapbook page, you know, I'm not worried about it, and what I stick down on it is I know if I don't like it, I can paint over it. Sorry, I think I said scrapbook page there. I meant art journal page. So yeah, a scrapbook page is a little bit more permanent, I suppose, than an art journal page. I'm less likely to paint over the top of it if I don't like it. As I was going along, I found this old cogs stencil that I had in my stash. So I thought I'd add some extra cogs and detail into the background and just add a little bit more brown onto the page. I'm also going around the edge of my scrapbook, the vellum, with the distress ink, and again in walnut stain, just to help it pop out from the background a little bit more and just to give it a little bit of definition. Again, I'm going in with double-sided tape. I tend to use a lot just to make sure it's fairly secure. I'm working in a fairly damp area, so I just want to make sure everything's glued down really well. The grid paper came in handy as my use it up paper, so I'm going in with some brass paste from Finnabair, I think it is, just to add some detail onto my cog pieces. Now I'm applying it with my finger, and the reason I'm doing that is by applying it with your finger, you can sort of pull your finger up, and you can see I'm pouncing it along, and that gives you a little bit of texture to your piece. So even though it's quite fine, particularly that are different up the top, when you rub your finger across it, it's got some texture to it. I'm also going in and adding with the other two pieces and adding some black first, and with the piece I went in with the brass, I'm adding some black over the top just to give that sort of rusted, aged effect to the page. So once I've got these all painted up, you can see I'm going back in with the brass again and doing that same pouncing motion over the top to match up the pieces. With the chipboard that I'm using, or the ScrapFX chipboard that I'm using, any chipboard, I tend to always give it a base coat. If I'm putting something metallic over the top, I usually give it a base coat of black. If I'm putting colours over the top, particularly bright colours, I tend to give it a base coat of white. The reason for that is chipboard itself is absorbent, so it will absorb in some of the light and some of the colour from what you're working on. So if you want a really, really bright or really concentrated colour, do a base coat first, and it really helps for things to just pop out somewhat. Now I've got all my pieces painted, I need to decide where I'm going to put them down. And even though I auditioned them in lots of different places, I still needed to play around for a while working out where I wanted to stick them. I'm just using a mixed media glue to stick them down. I find with fine chipboard like this that wet glue is usually the best way to stick it down. Obviously you can't get tape in there, it's just a little bit too tricky. And if you use a wet glue, it dries clear, so it's not going to be an issue if something does accidentally squeeze out underneath. But you really don't need all that much glue to glue it down. It really is the bare minimum. It's very easy to put too much on, so just be really careful. If you're really concerned about it, you can get some fine liner tubes with really thin needle tip points that you can put onto your glue bottles, or you can put glue into these bottles, and that gives you a really fine point that you can apply your glue with. So I'm now going in with a transparency, it's called Antiquities Transparency, and it had this piece which said never stop wondering, never stop wondering. Great homophones there. Again, because I'm really smart, I glued all that down to the page before I'd attached that. I actually wanted to staple on both sides, but I couldn't get the staple in the other side, so I ended up with one staple and a tiny little bit of clear glue underneath the other side. just to make sure that it stayed glued down. So clear glue will work on the transparencies. It will dry clear. It doesn't affect it at all. You can actually see where it's glued down on my page now, which is fantastic. But staples work just as well if you've got one of those little staplers. The last thing to do on my page, or one of the last things to do on my page, is to add the journaling. Now, with a lot of my scrapbooking, I'm really passionate about journaling and adding journaling to what I'm doing, even in my art journals. It's really important to have that documentation of what it's all about. And funnily enough, the way I'm writing this piece is I got a Christmas card from an arty friend, and she had this beautiful font or handwriting that she'd written it in. So I had the Christmas card up in front of me as I was doing this so I could copy her handwriting, because it was just fabulous, which is mostly all in block letters, but the eyes have a little dot over the top like you used to do in high school. And it was just a really fun way of writing, but not having my own handwriting on it. I really quite enjoyed it. So this picture was documenting a trip I took with my then boyfriend, now husband, on the Apt Railway in northwest Tasmania, down the west coast. And it was just a magnificent day, and steam trains and rack and pinion trains and all sorts. So it was just a very steampunky day. And the different perspective was, I suppose, that we after we had that trip together, it was one of our first trips away, and we ended up with a different perspective of each other, realizing that we were both as nerdy as each other and had very similar interests. So it was a great day out. The other thing that I've started doing with my scrapbooking is not being precious about the photo, and it's okay to stick stuff over the top, and it's okay to journal on the photos as well. So I actually continued that journaling from one project life card onto my photo, and then onto the project life card down the bottom, and also just putting the date and where it happened. Once I'd done that, I really liked how it ended up, and off camera I decided that the chipboard just needed a little bit more. So on a different perspective, I got my white paint pen and just added some shadowing on it, just to add a little bit of detail or pop it out from the page a little bit more. And that was it. It was such a fun page to put together. I hope it inspires you to do something with your new steampunky bits and pieces. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.